Welcome back to Poor Richard's podcast. When we left off, the Constitution had just been ratified, and the new nation was preparing to elect its first president. Today, we're continuing that story with the man who lived it. Mr. President, you're speaking from the President's house in Philadelphia, correct?
Yes. Philadelphia serves as the temporary capital until the government settles permanently on the Potomac. I've been here long enough to grow used to the sound of carriage wheels on Market Street. When I look back to December of 1788, it's strange to think how certain everyone seemed about the election. I wasn't a candidate in any sense. There were no campaigns, no speeches, no parties holding conventions. Still, every letter I received assumed that I would be the one chosen. The country wanted a familiar name at the head of this new experiment, and after the war, mine was the one they trusted. I didn't take it as a compliment so much as a summons. I tried to convince myself that someone else could do it. John Adams, maybe, or even Governor Hancock, but the pressure grew too strong. Madison wrote to me that the eyes of the continent were fixed on Mount Vernon. Even foreign observers expected it. By the end of that winter, I understood there was no avoiding it. I could either accept willingly or appear indifferent to the Republic's success, and I wasn't willing to risk that impression. When word came in early 1789 that the electors had voted, I learned the result was unanimous, 69 votes. There was satisfaction in the unity, but I can't say there was joy. I remember reading the notice at my desk and feeling an odd mixture of pride and dread. The letter was short, the meaning enormous. Martha understood immediately that our quiet life was over. She accepted it gracefully but not happily. She called the presidency her second widowhood. Before leaving, I settled every matter I could: estate accounts, planting schedules, the management of our laborers, even instructions on how to handle correspondence. I wanted nothing left undone at Mount Vernon in case I never returned. On April 16th, I left for New York, escorted by a few friends and officers. I intended the trip to be simple, but the country had other ideas. At every stop, the crowds grew. Towns put up arches of flowers. Militia companies paraded. Bells rang. It was touching, but also uncomfortable. At Trenton, the women of the town built an arch with the words, "The defender of the mothers will be the protector of the daughters." They sang as I crossed the bridge and threw petals on the road. I doubt I'll ever forget it, though I felt undeserving of that kind of devotion.
I imagine the attention made it hard to think. It's a curious thing. Men claim to want simplicity, but they can't resist ceremony once they have a hero to point at.
That's true. By the time I reached New York, the celebrations were more elaborate than ever. I crossed the Hudson in a barge rowed by 13 pilots in white uniforms. Cannons fired salutes from the forts. Ships filled the harbor, and crowds shouted from the docks. It was almost too much to take in. I remember thinking that the applause wasn't for me personally. It was relief. People were ready for stability after years of uncertainty. Once in New York, I stayed first at Samuel Osgood's house on Cherry Street. The city was the temporary seat of government, and space was limited. From the moment I arrived, committees visited daily with questions: what form the inauguration should take, how Congress should address me, even what kind of coach I ought to ride in. Everything was new, and everyone feared doing it wrong. The inauguration took place on April 30th at Federal Hall. The weather was mild, and I wore a plain brown suit made from American cloth. Chancellor Robert Livingston administered the oath on the second-floor balcony facing Broad Street. I placed my hand on the Bible, repeated the words, and added my own, "So help me God." When it was finished, Livingston turned to the crowd and shouted, "Long live George Washington, President of the United States." The cheers echoed all the way down to the Battery. Inside, I delivered my inaugural address to the Senate and House. It wasn't long, just a few pages, but I spent days writing it. I wanted to strike the right tone. gratitude without boasting, confidence without arrogance. I told them I felt unequal to the task, and that success would depend on the virtue of the people as much as on the wisdom of their leaders. Looking back, I still believe that. After the ceremony, the real work began. There was no government machinery in place, no departments, no staff, barely any money. We had to create everything from scratch. Congress moved slowly. The members were still feeling out their roles. I met with them almost daily to discuss revenue, foreign affairs, and the organization of the executive branch. It was exhausting, but necessary. At first, I planned to keep few advisors, but it became clear I'd need a cabinet. I asked Alexander Hamilton to handle the Treasury. He accepted immediately. Thomas Jefferson, returning from France, took the State Department. Henry Knox, my old comrade from the Army, remained at war, and Edmund Randolph became Attorney General. Those four formed the nucleus of the administration. It worked well enough at the beginning, though their disagreements would soon test my patience.
And you set the tone for the presidency at the same time. Titles, behavior, the way you met the public. Many thought you were too formal. Others thought you weren't formal enough.
Yes. Congress even debated what I should be called. Some senators favored His Highness or His Excellency. I insisted on Mr. President. I'd had enough of grand titles under the British Crown. I wanted respect, not ceremony. Still, I believed the office should have dignity. Every Tuesday I held public receptions where citizens could meet me briefly. On Thursdays I hosted formal dinners for officials and foreign guests. The idea was to show the presidency as accessible but orderly. Some newspapers mocked the formality, claiming I was trying to build a court. They misunderstood. My purpose was simply to show that government could be decent and disciplined without being royal. Those early weeks were consumed with small questions that carried large meaning. How to address Congress, whether to visit the Senate in person, even how to sign my letters. I quickly learned that a president's habits become examples, and examples become expectations. That awareness never left me. The hardest adjustment wasn't ceremony, though. It was isolation. Once in office, it felt as though I lived behind glass. Every word was reported, every expression analyzed. Letters arrived from all over the country asking favors, demanding answers, or offering advice. I spent hours each night reading them until my eyes blurred. There were no vacations, no true privacy. Yet I knew that if the presidency failed, the whole system could collapse. My main concern was stability, to prove that a free government could function with order. We had just enough time under the Articles to see what chaos looked like. We couldn't afford a second failure. By the end of that first spring, I began to see signs of progress. Congress passed the first revenue laws. Plans were underway for a federal judiciary. The machinery was crude, but moving. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe the Constitution might actually work. Once the inauguration ended and the celebrations faded, the real difficulties began. The Constitution had outlined the framework of government, but the framework was all we had. There were no offices, no bureaucracy, no revenue system, only the expectation that these things would appear somehow. The public assumed everything would fall neatly into place. It didn't. Every law, every appointment, every letter required thought and precedent. My first priority was establishing the executive departments. We needed order and division of labor. The Department of State handled foreign affairs, war-managed defense, and the Treasury oversaw finances. Congress created these departments by law, but it was my job to fill them and coordinate their work. I relied heavily on men I trusted: Henry Knox from the Army, Edmund Randolph from Virginia, and soon Alexander Hamilton, who proved indispensable. Hamilton took charge of the Treasury with a level of energy I've seldom seen matched. He worked constantly, nights, Sundays, holidays. His mind was quick, sometimes too quick for others to follow. He believed that the federal government had to assume the debts of the states and establish firm credit, or we'd be treated as a collection of bankrupt colonies. His plans were ambitious and not without controversy, but they gave the government substance. Without his system, I doubt we would have survived our first decade. While Hamilton organized the finances, Jefferson returned from France to lead the Department of State. He brought a different perspective, cautious, skeptical of centralized power, sympathetic to the French Revolution. Hamilton and Jefferson agreed on little beyond loyalty to me. Their arguments filled my cabinet meetings. I often let them debate at length, hoping the clash of ideas might produce balance. It rarely did. At first, though, I valued the variety of counsel. Hamilton's vigor built institutions. Jefferson's restraint kept them from becoming overbearing. Together, they represented the two sides of the American experiment, strength and liberty. I hoped they would learn to respect each other. Instead, they built opposing factions that later hardened into parties. That was never my intention. Meanwhile, we faced immediate practical problems. The revenue laws passed in 1789 provided modest income through customs duties, but not enough. We had to create a judicial system from the ground up. The Judiciary Act of 1789 established the Supreme Court, district courts, and circuit courts. I nominated John Jay as the first Chief Justice, a man of sense and integrity. I also signed the bill creating the Department of Foreign Affairs, later renamed the State Department. By the close of that year, we had a government that existed on paper and, for the first time, in practice.
And with all that, you still had to deal with Congress finding its feet. I remember those sessions, long speeches, endless committees, and no clear lines of authority. Did you ever think the whole thing might stall before it even began?
More than once. Congress moved slowly and argued endlessly. Every measure was dissected as if the fate of the Republic depended on a comma. But I tried to remain patient. The process itself was proof that the system worked. They argued because they were free to argue. I did, however, learn that persuasion required more than speeches. It required steady pressure and personal example. During the first session, they debated the Bill of Rights. Some members wanted to reopen the entire Constitution. I discouraged that. I supported adding clear protections for individual liberty, but I warned against tampering with the structure we had only just ratified. Madison took charge of the amendments, and by 1791, 10 of them had been approved. Those 10 became the Bill of Rights. It helped quiet many who had opposed the Constitution and gave the people confidence that their freedoms were secure.
You mentioned the Bill of Rights. That was no small matter. I'm curious, how did you feel about the specific amendments? The first few especially, freedom of speech, religion, the right to bear arms. Were there any that you felt particularly strong about, or any you thought might one day be misunderstood?
Each amendment carried weight, though I considered some more essential to the preservation of liberty than others. The First Amendment was the cornerstone. Freedom of speech and religion had to be absolute in principle, or the entire experiment would eventually collapse under the weight of authority. I never feared criticism. What I feared was silence, a people too timid to question their leaders. As for the right to bear arms, I viewed it not as a call to constant readiness for rebellion, but as a recognition of responsibility. A citizenry capable of defending itself is a safeguard against both foreign invasion and domestic tyranny. But I also believed that liberty demands discipline. An armed public must be a lawful one. I had no single favorite amendment, though I often said that the Constitution's structure mattered as much as its protections. Rights mean little without a government stable enough to respect them. I expected future generations would argue over interpretation. That's human nature. But I hoped they'd keep the spirit of balance, individual liberty bound by public order. If that balance holds, the nation endures.
Let's talk more about religion. You were firm on that point, that government must never dictate belief. Why was that so important to you? Which faiths did you have in mind when you spoke of liberty, and what shaped that conviction?
My belief in religious freedom came from experience, not theory. During the war, I saw men from every denomination fight side by side: Anglicans, Presbyterians, Catholics, Quakers, Jews. They prayed in different ways, but they bled for the same cause. That taught me that character, not creed, determines loyalty. In the early colonies, religion had often been used as a dividing line. Some states favored one church, others punished dissenters. That practice caused nothing but resentment. I believed from the start that the national government must never repeat those mistakes. The revolution was fought for liberty in the fullest sense, and liberty of conscience is its foundation. In my view, religion is strongest when it is voluntary. Compulsion breeds hypocrisy. Liberty allows sincerity. A nation that protects conscience protects its own stability. History shows that when rulers try to command belief, they end up ruling by fear. I wanted no part of that.
That's well said, but it raises another question, and forgive my directness. What about your own beliefs? You often spoke of providence, but never much about doctrine. How would you describe your own faith?
I've never found it useful to wear faith as a badge. My convictions are private, though steady. I believe firmly in divine providence, that there is a guiding hand over human affairs, though we seldom understand its purposes. I've seen too many narrow escapes, too many coincidences in war and peace to doubt it. As for sectarian matters, I've always attended services where I lived. In Virginia, that meant the Episcopal Church, but I've never thought salvation depended on form. What matters most is conduct, honesty, duty, and respect for others. Religion, in my mind, should make men better citizens, not bitter opponents. I prayed often, but seldom in public. Not out of indifference, but from a sense that faith loses something when paraded for show. A man's actions are his truest creed. If I've lived with consistency and moderation, that's the best testimony I can offer.
That sounds like belief by example, religion expressed in conduct, not ceremony.
Precisely. Governments can preserve liberty, only individual conscience can preserve virtue. The two depend on each other. That, more than any creed, was the principle I tried to follow.
One more question before we move on, and I'll admit it's a hypothetical one. You spoke earlier of the right to bear arms as a matter of civic responsibility. In my own time, a musket was slow and clumsy. In the world that followed us, weapons have grown far more powerful, repeating rifles, pistols, even machines that can fire dozens of rounds in a minute. If you had known such tools would exist, would you still have supported the Second Amendment as written?
The principle would stand, though the practice might require prudence. The right itself was not written for a particular weapon, but for a condition of citizenship, that free men should have the means to defend themselves and their country. The danger comes not from the arms, but from the temper of those who hold them. When I spoke of a well-regulated militia, regulated meant trained and disciplined, subject to the laws of the Republic. The framers never imagined a people armed yet lawless. The right and the duty were meant to exist together. If the arms of later centuries became more destructive, I would expect the laws to be equally deliberate in governing their use. Liberty must always be balanced by order. To preserve one without the other is to invite ruin. I would not wish to see citizens disarmed, but neither would I wish to see the Republic endangered by the misuse of power, whether that power lies in government or in private hands. The amendment spirit is self-protection and civic readiness, not license. Its survival depends on responsibility, not excess. Another pressing matter was the permanent location of the capital. Northern and southern interests clashed. The compromise, largely brokered by Hamilton and Jefferson, placed the capital on the Potomac in exchange for federal assumption of state debts. It wasn't perfect, but it solved two disputes at once. That's politics at its best, imperfect agreement that keeps the country moving. In the midst of all that, I faced personal challenges. I fell ill during the summer of 1789, shortly after taking office. The constant work and public demands took their toll. For several weeks, I suffered from severe fever and infection. Some believed I might not survive. It reminded me how fragile both my health and the new government were. I recovered, though slowly, and resumed duties as soon as I could. I didn't want rumors of my death spreading panic. The second session of Congress brought more organization, the establishment of a national bank, further revenue laws, and regulations for the territories. Hamilton pushed the Bank of the United States as essential to our financial system. Jefferson opposed it, arguing the Constitution gave no such power. I listened to both sides. My own reading of the Constitution allowed for implied powers, authority necessary to fulfill explicit duties. So I signed the Bank Bill in 1791. That decision pleased one half of the country and angered the other, but I believed it necessary. Throughout these years, the presidency evolved daily. My role was often that of mediator, balancing strong personalities and regional interests. I wrote constantly to governors, foreign ministers, generals, and ordinary citizens. Most nights I stayed at my desk until after midnight. Every document seemed to carry national consequence. I rarely saw Mount Vernon, and began to wonder if I'd ever truly retire there again.
You were already thinking about retirement that early?
I was. Even in 1791, I intended to serve only one term. I wanted to set the example that the presidency was not a lifetime appointment. But as time went on, I realized stepping down too soon could be dangerous. The system was still fragile. Factional disputes could undo everything we'd built. I decided to remain until stability took firmer hold. Those first 2 years taught me that the presidency isn't about personal ambition, but endurance. Every day brought decisions without precedent: domestic policy, foreign relations, even social customs. The simplest act, shaking hands instead of bowing, refusing a title, declining invitations to partisan gatherings, helped define what the office would be. The people watched constantly. They needed to see that authority could exist without arrogance. By 1791, the government functioned well enough to command respect abroad. Britain and Spain began treating our ministers with greater seriousness. France was in revolution, which concerned Jefferson greatly, but I believed our role was neutrality. We were too new and too vulnerable to involve ourselves in European quarrels. That policy would be tested soon enough, but it started there, in those first cautious years. Domestically, Hamilton's financial plan was taking shape. Assumption of state debts, establishment of the national bank, and excise taxes to fund operations. The credit of the United States improved almost immediately. Merchants trusted our currency. Investors began to see the government as stable. But resentment also grew in the countryside, especially over the whiskey tax. That anger would later erupt into open defiance. But at this point, it was only grumbling. Looking back, those early years were the hardest, but also the most vital. We built the foundation of what followed. Mistakes were made, perhaps many, but we gave the country a functioning government where none had existed. I said once that the due administration of justice is the firmest pillar of good government. In 1791, for the first time, that pillar stood upright.
And you managed it all without ever having an example to follow. The first man to hold an office has to invent it while occupying it. You had to be your own precedent.
Yes, and that was the greatest challenge. Every action of mine became a reference point. There were no mistakes that would go unnoticed, and no successes that would remain purely mine. I accepted that because someone had to. The presidency couldn't remain an abstraction. It had to be lived in, shaped, and tested. By 1791, we'd proven it could endure. The rest would be a matter of maintaining that endurance, something easier said than done. By the end of 1791, the machinery of government was running, but friction was already building beneath the surface. The success of Hamilton's financial plan gave the country credit, but it also created resentment. Farmers, especially in the western counties of Pennsylvania, objected to the excise tax on whiskey. For them, whiskey wasn't just drink, it was currency. It was easier to transport and trade than grain. When the tax collectors arrived, they were met with resistance, sometimes violence. I tried at first to leave enforcement to the local authorities. I wanted to avoid sending soldiers against citizens if it could be helped. But it was clear the resentment was spreading. I reminded the governors that the law had been passed by Congress and applied to all alike. It wasn't tyranny, it was revenue. Still, the anger grew. It would take a few more years before it erupted openly, but the signs were already there. The Western unrest wasn't our only problem. On the frontier, fighting with native tribes continued. The British had not fully left the forts they'd promised to evacuate, and they encouraged resistance among the tribes of the Northwest Territory. General Arthur St. Clair led a campaign in 1791 that ended in disaster. Hundreds of our soldiers killed, the worst defeat the army had suffered at the hands of native forces. The news hit hard. Congress demanded explanations, and I ordered a full inquiry. It showed poor organization, weak discipline, and inexperience. I reorganized the army and appointed General Mad Anthony Wayne to rebuild it. He was relentless, and over time he restored order and morale. But in 91 and 92, it felt as though the frontier itself might be slipping away. By 1792, I had served nearly 4 years and was ready to retire. My health wasn't what it had been, and the constant disputes among my cabinet had worn me down. The press had become more aggressive, accusing me of everything from favoritism to monarchy. I told several close friends, including Madison, that I intended to step aside after my first term. I even began drafting a letter announcing my retirement. It would later form the basis of my farewell address, though I didn't publish it at the time. My purpose wasn't to dramatize my departure, but to set a precedent, that the presidency was not a lifetime position. I wanted to demonstrate that the Republic could continue without its first leader. However, when word of my intentions spread privately, letters began arriving urging me to stay. Hamilton wrote that my withdrawal would put the government in jeopardy. Jefferson, despite our disagreements, said much the same. They both feared what might happen if I left, though for different reasons. Hamilton worried about instability in the finances. Jefferson feared a rise in monarchical influence. It was one of the few things they ever agreed on. At first, I resisted. I felt that my departure might help calm the political feuds that were tearing the country apart. But the more I listened, the more I understood that leaving so soon might do greater harm. The government was still young. The parties were forming faster than the institutions that were meant to balance them. If I stepped away abruptly, the presidency might fall into the same partisan hands that had divided the cabinet. By the autumn of 1792, I decided to accept a second term, reluctantly, but out of necessity. I made no effort to seek it. There were no campaigns or speeches. That sort of thing didn't exist then. The electors simply met again that December. Once more, the result was unanimous. Every elector voted for me. John Adams remained vice president, though his margin was smaller. I accepted the result not with celebration, but with resignation. I knew the next 4 years would be harder than the first. The disagreements between Hamilton and Jefferson had spread into the public. The newspapers attacked each side with increasing venom. My own neutrality between them pleased neither. I had hoped the example of unity might endure longer. Instead, it lasted barely a term.
And by then, the tone of the country had changed too. The revolution was no longer a memory, it was an argument. You had one side quoting liberty and another quoting order, each claiming to be the true guardian of the republic. I imagine that made governing twice as difficult.
It did. The people's divisions reflected those of their leaders. In some states, the newspapers supporting Jefferson's followers accused Hamilton of trying to restore monarchy. In others, Hamilton's allies accused Jefferson's of plotting anarchy. The truth lay somewhere in between. I often felt like a referee trying to calm two angry players who both wanted to call themselves the winning team. When the electors' decision reached me early in 1793, I thanked them, but told my secretary that to be again called into public service is as painful as it is honorable. I accepted because I believed stability demanded it, not because I desired another term. Privately, I told Hamilton that if I could retire without harming the country, I would have done so immediately. The second inauguration in March of 1793 was simple and brief. There was no procession, no parade, no balcony ceremony. I took the oath of office in the Senate chamber, gave a short address, and returned to work. I had asked that the event be modest. The novelty of the presidency had passed, and the office didn't need more spectacle. I remember feeling that morning the same weight I had 4 years earlier, but heavier. The first term had been spent building. The second would be spent preserving. Factions were sharpening, Europe was at war, and our neutrality would be tested. I knew that what lay ahead would define not only my presidency, but the survival of the Constitution itself. Still, I took some comfort in the progress we'd made. The departments functioned, the courts were organized, and the Treasury was on sounder footing than ever before. The capital compromise had been settled, a new federal city planned along the Potomac, which Congress named in my honor, though I never requested it. That decision, at least, felt like closure on one long debate. But as 1793 began, I could see clearly that unity was fading. The very success of the government had awakened new ambitions. The next few years would test whether our system could handle political conflict without destroying itself. I resolved that my role was to hold the middle ground for as long as possible, to show that moderation was not weakness and that the presidency belonged to no faction.
And you were about to learn just how hard it is to stay in the middle when everyone wants to pull you to one side or the other.
Exactly. The months ahead, with foreign wars, partisan newspapers, and domestic unrest, would make that balance harder to maintain. But in 1792, I had at least one quiet victory: the peaceful re-election of a president by free citizens. That had never happened before in modern history. It proved that change of leadership, even if only theoretical that time, could occur without bloodshed. It was a small step, but a meaningful one. I still met with both men, sometimes together, sometimes separately. I respected them each for their talents, but the tension between them was constant. Jefferson feared Hamilton's system would create a class of moneyed interests that would dominate the government. Hamilton believed Jefferson's sympathies for the French Revolution were dangerous and would lead to chaos. I saw some truth in both arguments, but I reminded them that our concern was the United States, not Europe. By 1793, the disagreements had spread into Congress and the press. Newspapers took sides. Anonymous pamphlets accused me of favoring one faction over another. Some even suggested I was becoming a monarch in disguise. That kind of talk angered me, but I ignored it publicly. The dignity of the office demanded silence in the face of insults. Privately, I told friends I was weary of the infamous scribblers, but I refused to answer them.
You had to keep your temper more than any man I've ever known. I read some of those papers, the sort that accuse first and reason later. A future president would refer to these infamous scribbles as fake news. It's remarkable how quickly gratitude fades once politics takes hold.
It fades faster than one might think. Still, I couldn't afford to let personal feeling interfere. The government was stronger than it had been, but it was not yet stable enough to endure reckless disputes. My focus remained on administration, on proving that Republican government could handle problems calmly and lawfully. Foreign affairs soon gave us a new test. In 1793, France declared war on Britain, Spain, and the Netherlands. The French Revolution had begun as a call for liberty, but by then it had turned violent. The beheading of King Louis shocked Europe. Jefferson believed we owed France support because they had helped us during our own revolution. Hamilton argued the opposite, that our treaty had been with the French monarchy, not the new government. He warned that involvement would ruin us. I saw the danger clearly. Our military was small, our finances still fragile, and our people divided in sympathy. Taking sides in a European war would have been ruinous. On April 22, 1793, I issued the Proclamation of Neutrality. It stated plainly that the United States would remain friendly with all nations, but take no part in the war. That decision caused outrage among Jefferson's followers, who accused me of betraying France. But I knew neutrality was our only practical choice. The situation grew more complicated with the arrival of Edmond Charles Genet, the new French minister. He landed in Charleston and began recruiting privateers to attack British ships without consulting our government. When he reached Philadelphia, he was met by cheering crowds who saw him as a hero of liberty. I received him formally, but when he continued his activities in defiance of our laws, I demanded his recall. That affair, the Citizen Genet affair, as the newspapers called it, forced us to define how we would handle foreign agents. It was unpleasant, but necessary. The Neutrality Proclamation proved wise in the long run. It kept us out of war and showed that the United States would act independently, not as an attachment to any European power. It also set a precedent for our foreign policy that lasted for generations. But at the time, it came at a cost. The Republicans accused me of favoring Britain. The Federalists accused me of being too cautious, and both sides accused me of listening to the other. I concluded that if both extremes were displeased, I might be standing on the right ground. Domestically, the government continued to grow. The post office expanded. New territories were organized in the West. Settlers moved beyond the Appalachian Mountains faster than the law could follow them. I sent surveyors, including a young Andrew Ellicott, to mark boundaries and establish order. The Northwest Territory, despite earlier setbacks, was slowly taking shape. In the South, we negotiated treaties with several native nations to reduce raids and open routes for trade. Not all those treaties held, but they provided temporary peace. We had to balance fairness with necessity. Expansion was inevitable, but I insisted that it be done through lawful agreement rather than conquest when possible. That ideal was not always met, but it remained my policy. By the end of 1793, I began to feel the toll of the office more keenly. The constant strain, political, diplomatic, personal, wore on me. I told friends I longed to retire, but events kept pulling me back. Every time I thought of stepping away, another crisis appeared. Still, I never lost sight of what we had built. For all its noise and quarrels, the government functioned. The courts sat, the laws were enforced, the treasury balanced its accounts, and the flag was respected abroad. That, I reminded myself, was no small thing for a nation barely 4 years old.
No small thing indeed. I've seen governments twice as old crumble under less pressure. You had a republic that barely learned to crawl, already being pulled toward opposite directions by ideology, war, and frontier unrest. Yet you held it steady.
Steady was all I could manage, but it was enough. My guiding principle was always moderation, to act firmly without acting rashly. In 1793, that moderation was tested constantly, but it kept the nation intact. Those years taught me that a president's greatest power isn't in issuing orders or signing laws. It's in setting a tone that others can trust. If the people believe their government is calm, they remain calm. If they see panic, they panic. That's the weight of the office. After the Neutrality Proclamation in 1793, my attention turned to enforcing it. It was one thing to declare neutrality, another to make citizens respect it. Privateers commissioned by France continued seizing British vessels in American waters. British warships retaliated by stopping American ships bound for France. Each incident risked dragging us into war. I instructed customs officers to detain foreign privateers and confiscate prizes brought into our ports. It angered many, but neutrality meant nothing if it wasn't upheld. The public mood was divided. Federalists supported the policy. Republicans called it a betrayal of our revolutionary ally. The press inflamed the dispute. Some papers accused me of favoring monarchy. Others called me a secret Anglophile. I learned quickly that reason rarely competes well with rumor. I kept silent publicly, believing the best answer to accusation was consistent conduct. Meanwhile, our Western troubles persisted. The reorganized army under General Wayne finally marched against the tribes resisting American expansion in the Northwest Territory. In August 1794, at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, Wayne's forces defeated them decisively. The resulting Treaty of Greenville the following year secured most of what is now Ohio for settlement. It was a harsh outcome for the tribes, but it ended years of bloodshed on that frontier. I was relieved more than proud. A president doesn't count victories the same way a general does.
You finally had peace on the frontier, but almost at once trouble flared up closer to home, the Whiskey Rebellion. What exactly brought that on? Was it truly about the tax, or was something deeper driving that resistance?
The trouble began with the excise tax on distilled spirits, part of Hamilton's plan to fund the federal government. In the eastern states, payment was inconvenient but manageable. In the western territories, it was different. Farmers there often turned their grain into whiskey because it was easier to transport and trade than raw crops. The tax hit them hardest. At first, the opposition was legal. Petitions, public meetings, and letters of protest. But by 1793, resistance had turned violent. Revenue officers were threatened, some tarred and feathered. In several counties, courts refused to enforce the law. The movement began calling itself a whiskey army. It wasn't simply about taxation. It was about federal authority. The same men who had once defied the British government now questioned whether the new republic was any better. I watched the situation for months, hoping the state authorities could restore order. They tried conciliation, but it failed. By the summer of 1794, open defiance had spread. A group of rebels even talked of marching on Pittsburgh. I could not let that stand. If the government allowed armed resistance to succeed once, it would never enforce any law again. Under the Militia Act, I requested troops from several states, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Maryland, and New Jersey. The response was overwhelming. Nearly 13,000 militiamen volunteered, more than had fought in many battles of the Revolution. I decided to accompany them part of the way west to show that the action came from civilian authority, not military ambition. When the rebels learned of the army's approach, their organization collapsed. Most fled before a shot was fired. A few were captured and later pardoned. The goal was never punishment, but principle, to demonstrate that the laws of the United States carried real weight. It was an unpleasant duty, No president likes to march troops against his own citizens, but necessary. Rebellion had to be answered by law, not indulgence. Once people saw that the government could act firmly, yet fairly, respect for it increased. The rebellion's failure, quiet as it was, strengthened the Constitution more than any victory in battle could have. The same year we faced a growing crisis with Britain. Despite the end of the Revolution, they still occupied forts in our northwest, interfered with trade, and seized American ships bound for French ports. We couldn't afford another war, so I sent Chief Justice John Jay to London to negotiate a settlement. It was an unpopular decision. Many thought Britain would never bargain fairly, but diplomacy was our only option.
That treaty became a lightning rod. I remember seeing crowds burn Jay in effigy before they even knew what was in it.
They judged it before reading it, as people often do. Jay returned in 1795 with a treaty that wasn't perfect, but it prevented war. Britain agreed to withdraw from the frontier forts and to compensate for seized ships, while we promised to pay pre-war debts owed to British merchants. It was a compromise. Better than conflict, worse than ideal. When the text became public, the reaction was explosive. Demonstrations broke out in cities across the country. Newspapers denounced it as surrender. Hamilton was stoned while defending it in New York. Even in Congress, members shouted that I'd betrayed the revolution. I read every line carefully before deciding to ratify it. I didn't like every article, but the alternatives were worse. Our country was still too weak for another war with Britain. I signed the treaty in August 1795. The Senate approved it by a narrow margin, and though public anger continued for months, the storm eventually passed. Trade with Britain increased, and peace held. In time, even the critics admitted it preserved stability. But during those months, it felt as though the unity of the nation itself might break. Jefferson had resigned from the cabinet at the end of 1793, worn down by constant conflict with Hamilton. I regretted his departure, though I understood it. Hamilton followed 2 years later. Their rivalry had defined much of my first term, and with both gone, I found the silence almost unfamiliar. Yet the damage their disputes left behind remained. The country was divided between their followers, and those divisions hardened into the first political parties. I never joined either side. I told friends that party spirit was a fire not to be quenched. It demands a uniform vigilance to prevent its bursting into flame. But by 1795 it was clear that no warning of mine would stop it. Factions had taken root in Congress, in newspapers, even in state legislatures. Every decision was interpreted through a partisan lens. It made governing difficult, but I tried to stay above it. In private, I confided to a few friends that I was tired, not of work, but of the noise surrounding it. The constant accusations, the demands for favors, the letters urging me to dismiss one man or another, it wore me down. I began seriously considering retirement after my first term. I even drafted a farewell address in 1792, but held it back when urged to remain. By 1795, I was more certain that the time was near. The government was functioning, the treasury stable, and the courts respected. My leaving would test whether the Republic could change leaders peacefully. That, I believed, was the final proof of success.
And that test would come soon enough. I remember hearing that even some of your closest friends begged you to stay, saying the country would unravel without you. But it seems your mind was set by then.
It was. No man should hold power too long. 2 terms was enough for any president, and I wanted to make that the standard. The next election would determine whether our system could survive without its first commander at the helm. I believed it could. It had to. My duty was to ensure that the transition would be calm and orderly. Before stepping down, I had one more task, to address the nation directly and explain my reasons for retiring. I wanted to warn against the dangers I'd witnessed, the rise of factions, the influence of foreign powers, and the temptation to place party above country. Those thoughts would soon take written form in what became my farewell address. But before we reach that, I should say one thing about those years. They were exhausting but instructive. The Neutrality Proclamation, the Whiskey Rebellion, the Jay Treaty, each tested a different part of the Constitution. And each time the government held. That was the measure of our success. A free people had managed to solve disputes through law rather than force. The experiment had survived its first storms. By 1796, I knew the time had come to leave public life. The past 7 years had aged me more than war ever did. The divisions between parties had grown sharper, and even my attempts at neutrality had become causes for attack. I wanted to step down while the government still stood firm, not wait until fatigue made me a liability. I told only a few close friends of my decision early that year. Hamilton urged me to reconsider, as he had before, but this time I was resolute. The government was functioning. The Constitution had survived its early tests. It was time to show the world that America could change leaders peacefully. That was the last proof our experiment required. I began drafting a message to the people announcing my retirement. For guidance, I revisited the notes I'd written 4 years earlier when I first planned to resign. I sent the new draft to Hamilton for review. He was a skilled writer and understood my intentions. His edits helped sharpen the language, but the sentiments were entirely mine. I wanted to remind the people of what we had achieved, to warn them of the dangers I had seen firsthand, and to part from office without bitterness or vanity. I decided not to deliver the address in person, but to publish it in print. It appeared in the American Daily Advertiser on September 19, 1796. The document was long, but I hoped it would serve as both reflection and instruction. I began by thanking the nation for its confidence and affection, and I expressed gratitude for the success we had shared. Then I explained my reasons for leaving, not from dissatisfaction, but from a belief that rotation in office was essential to liberty. The heart of the address was caution. I warned against permanent alliances with foreign nations, against entangling our peace with their quarrels. I urged the people to guard against excessive party spirit, which I called a fire not to be quenched. I had seen how party divisions distorted public opinion and turned honest men into enemies. I feared that if unchecked, those factions would one day endanger the Union itself. I also reminded citizens that religion and morality were necessary supports of political prosperity, and that the Constitution was strong only so long as the people respected it. My intent was not to lecture, but to leave behind what wisdom I could. The presidency had given me a wide view of human nature and politics, and I wanted to set down what experience had taught me before I returned to private life. I expected criticism, and I received plenty. Federalist papers praised it. Republican ones called it a farewell to monarchy. But I had grown used to that kind of talk. The address wasn't written to please one side or the other. It was meant for the country as a whole, for anyone who cared to listen. The months that followed were quieter than I expected. I continued my duties as usual while the election of 1796 unfolded. I stayed completely neutral, though privately I hoped the contest would remain civil. John Adams represented the Federalists, Thomas Jefferson the Republicans. The campaign was bitter and personal, worse than any before it. The newspapers printed falsehoods daily. I kept out of it. The best way to honor the office was to leave it untouched by partisanship. When the results came in, Adams had won by a narrow margin. Jefferson, finishing second, became vice president under the constitutional system of the time. They were political opponents, but the transition was peaceful. That, to me, was the true victory. For the first time, one elected leader would hand the presidency to another without conflict or bloodshed. As the end of my term approached, I began preparing to leave Philadelphia. I made arrangements to settle accounts, return household staff to Mount Vernon, and finish pending correspondence. Foreign ministers called to pay their respects, some expressing disbelief that a man in power would willingly give it up. I told them that in our country, power was not property, it was a trust. When the time came, it must be returned. On March 4th, 1797, John Adams took the oath of office in the Hall of Congress. I attended the ceremony as a private citizen for the first time in 8 years. When it ended, I shook Adams' hand, wished him well, and quietly left. There was no parade, no fanfare. I left the city the next morning at sunrise. My carriage crossed the Schuylkill, and I felt as if a heavy weight had lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in years, I could breathe without expectation pressing down. The journey home to Mount Vernon was quiet. Villagers waved, but there were no great celebrations this time. I was grateful for that. When I rode up the drive and saw the house again, it felt as though I had been gone a lifetime. I told Martha that evening that I was finally home to stay. Retirement suited me better than I remembered. I turned my attention to the farm, to improving the soil, repairing fences, and reorganizing the property. Visitors came often, former officers, foreign guests, young politicians seeking advice. I tried to be polite but firm about keeping out of politics. I told them that the country had to learn to run without depending on one man's presence. Still, I watched events from a distance with concern. The old divisions hadn't disappeared. If anything, they'd deepened. Adams and Jefferson soon found themselves on opposite sides of the same quarrels that had begun years before in my cabinet. But that was no longer my burden. My duty was finished.
You once said that example was more powerful than command. Your resignation proved it. Every future president would have to measure himself against that standard. That power is temporary and service has an end.
That was my intention. If any part of my career endures, I hope it is that principle. That authority can be exercised honorably and relinquished peacefully. I had led armies and governments, but leaving them behind was the truest proof of freedom. When I left the presidency in March of 1797, my single wish was to return to a quiet life at Mount Vernon. For 8 years I had lived in constant motion, letters, meetings, decisions, and I wanted nothing more than to be left alone among the fields. The estate had suffered from neglect during my absence. Fences had fallen, fields were exhausted, and my overseers had done what they could, but management from a distance is never effective. I threw myself back into the work immediately. Most mornings began before sunrise. I'd ride through the farms, inspect the crops, speak with the overseers, and plan improvements. I experimented with crop rotation, fertilizers, and new tools. I kept detailed records of everything. The discipline of farming suited me. It was quiet, productive, and predictable. It reminded me of what I'd missed, order without politics. But even at Mount Vernon, politics had a way of finding me. Letters arrived almost daily from former colleagues and foreign ministers. Visitors showed up uninvited, hoping to hear my opinions on the new administration or the troubles with France. I avoided comment whenever I could. I had promised myself not to interfere with my successor. Adams deserved the same freedom I had been given to act according to his own judgment. I spent more time with Martha than I had in decades. We hosted family, friends, and sometimes officers from the old army. I also oversaw construction projects around the estate, new barns, mills, and improvements to the mansion itself. The Potomac Company, an old project of mine to improve navigation on the river, still demanded attention. I hoped better transportation would strengthen trade between the eastern seaboard and the western frontier. Despite my efforts to live quietly, the situation in Europe made that difficult. Relations with France had deteriorated rapidly after the Jay Treaty. The French government saw it as evidence of favoritism toward Britain and began seizing American ships. By 1798, it was clear that diplomatic efforts were failing. What became known as the XYZ affair, the attempt by French agents to demand bribes from our envoys, caused public outrage. Calls for war grew louder every week. President Adams began reorganizing the army in anticipation of possible conflict. Though Congress authorized a provisional force, there was immediate debate over who should command it. Without my knowledge, Adams and others began suggesting that I be recalled to service. I received the news by letter. My first reaction was dismay. I had no wish to return to the field at my age. But Adams wrote directly to me, saying that my acceptance would unite the country in a way no one else's could. I agreed reluctantly to serve as commander-in-chief if war came, on the condition that I would not take the field unless absolutely necessary. I made clear that Alexander Hamilton would serve as my second-in-command and handle most of the day-to-day organization. Some disagreed with that choice, but Hamilton's ability was beyond question. I valued competence over popularity. Reorganizing the army proved difficult. Recruiting men, appointing officers, and securing supplies all took longer than expected. The sense of urgency was high, but the danger of war began to fade before the army was fully formed. President Adams, to his credit, pursued diplomacy instead of escalation. The result was peace, though not without strain between us. Adams resented my continued influence, and I understood why. No president wants to share the spotlight with his predecessor. I tried to stay out of sight and let him lead.
You seem to have spent half your life trying to retire, only to be called back again. Some men chase glory, others have it chase them.
I've had my fill of both. Service is a duty, not a pleasure. When I accepted command in 1798, I did so only because the country seemed to need unity more than soldiers. If my name could provide that unity, it was the least I could offer. But in truth, my involvement was mostly symbolic. I reviewed plans, gave advice, and helped select officers, but I never left Mount Vernon again. The Provisional Army, as they called it, never saw combat. Life on the estate continued much as before. I managed production of wheat and corn, oversaw the distillery we had recently built, and kept accounts as precisely as any quartermaster. Farming offered a kind of clarity that politics never could. You plant, you tend, you harvest. Nature keeps its promises if you do your part. Governments are not so reliable. Visitors were constant. Foreign travelers, American dignitaries, and former officers came to pay their respects. Some came to ask favors, others simply to see the man they'd read about in newspapers. I tried to be polite to all of them, though it interrupted my work more often than not. I told one guest that my hours of retirement are the most pleasing of my life, yet they are the least at my own disposal. Still, I found satisfaction in the rhythm of daily life, the sound of hammers on the mill, the sight of the river at dawn, the quiet of the evening when the fields were still. I had lived long enough to see the Republic survive its infancy and begin to stand on its own. That was all I ever wanted. As the year 1798 came to a close, the tension with France eased. A formal peace had not yet been signed, but the danger of war had passed. I felt that my last public duty was finished. I hoped the rest of my life would be free of politics entirely. The country was in other hands now, capable ones, even if divided. My concern was that it should endure, not that I should shape it any further.
After all those years of command and government, to finally be free of it must have felt strange, like a soldier leaving the field and realizing the battle has gone on without him.
It did feel strange, but it was also liberating. For the first time in decades, I could watch events unfold without being responsible for their outcome. I could spend a morning in the fields instead of a council chamber, a night by the fire instead of at a desk. I told friends that I am now resolved to live and die on my own acres, and that is what I intended. The year 1799 began peacefully enough. The estate was in good order, the crops were strong, and the new distillery was running well. I spent most of that year managing improvements on the farms and completing business left unfinished from the Potomac Company. The work kept me occupied, and I was content. My days followed a familiar routine. I rose before dawn, had a simple breakfast, and set out on horseback to inspect the farms. The air along the Potomac that time of year was often damp and heavy, but I preferred the outdoors to the parlor. Even in my late 60s, I still rode several miles a day. In the evenings, I reviewed letters, balanced accounts, and spoke with Martha about household matters. Life had finally found its rhythm again. I also continued to handle correspondence from public officials, though I tried to avoid becoming involved in national politics. I wrote to Alexander Hamilton occasionally about the organization of the army and offered opinions when asked, but otherwise I stayed silent. The country seemed secure, and I saw no reason to interfere. My intention was to end my days as a private citizen. No titles, no offices, just peace. In December of that year, the weather turned quickly. On the 12th, I spent most of the day outside in snow and freezing rain, marking trees for cutting and inspecting fences. I returned home late in the afternoon with my coat soaked through. Martha urged me to change, but I told her I didn't want to keep the guests waiting for dinner. By evening, I felt chilled, but thought little of it. The next morning, I woke with a sore throat and hoarseness. It worsened through the day. I still rode out briefly to the grounds. Stubborn habit, perhaps, and the cold air made it worse. By nightfall, I could hardly speak. I took some simple remedies, but by the morning of the 14th, breathing had become difficult. We sent for doctors from Alexandria. 3 came in succession: Dr. Craik, who had treated me for years, Dr. Brown, and Dr. Dick. They agreed it was an inflammation of the throat, what they called inflammatory quinsy. They applied the usual treatments: bleeding, gargles, and blisters. I consented to everything they proposed. I had no fear, only discomfort. I remember telling Dr. Craik, "I die hard, but I am not afraid to go." Throughout the day, I felt my strength fading. I spoke little after the afternoon. It took too much effort. I gave instructions for some of my papers and asked that my burial be delayed 3 days to avoid any mistake. My last hours were quiet. I took Martha's hand and told her, "Go to the other room. I shall soon be gone." Those were my final words. I died between 10 and 11 that night, December 14th, 1799. The doctors estimated that I lost nearly 5 pints of blood in the course of treatment. Whether that hastened the end, no one can say. Medicine was as much art as science in those days. But I left this world with a clear mind and a settled conscience. My affairs were in order and the country was at peace. I could ask no more than that.
You faced death the same way you faced everything else, directly, without complaint. There's a kind of symmetry in it. You led the army through a revolution, held the nation together in peace, and left it standing on its own feet. Few men get to see their work endure like that.
I was fortunate, and I knew it. My death was sudden, but not tragic. I had lived long enough to see the Republic survive its infancy. I had known both triumph and failure, and I had the comfort of leaving the world better than I found it. That is all a man can reasonably ask. In my will, I made provisions for Martha, for my family, and for the people who had served me faithfully. I also included a clause that freed the enslaved individuals I owned outright upon her death. It was a decision long considered. I had come to believe that the practice, while lawful, was inconsistent with the principles for which we had fought. I could not undo the past, but I could set an example for the future. After my passing, word spread quickly. Congress adjourned in mourning, and cities held public ceremonies. I was buried at Mount Vernon on December 18th, with a small service conducted by local clergy and a company of soldiers. There was no grand procession, only the sound of the river and the winter wind. I had requested nothing more. What mattered most to me was that the government continued without pause. Adams remained president. The courts continued their sessions, and the Union held. That was the true measure of success, that the Republic no longer depended on any single man.
And that is, I think, how history will always remember you, not as a man who sought power, but as one who gave it up and left behind a government that could stand on its own.
That was my hope. No man's name should stand above his country. The strength of the United States lies not in its founders, but in the people who preserve what was founded. I lived long enough to see that begin. I only wish to be remembered as one who tried to serve faithfully.
When word of George Washington's death reached Philadelphia, the entire city went silent. The bells of Christ Church tolled for an hour. Congress adjourned for days. President Adams declared a national mourning period that lasted until the following February. Black crepe hung from doorways, and ministers in every state delivered sermons in his memory. It was the first time Americans had grieved together for one man, not as colonists or partisans, but as citizens of the same nation. I remember reading the official announcement, first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. It wasn't flattery. It was simply true. Washington's death was more than the loss of a person. It was a test of what he had built. For the first time, the Republic faced the future without its most unifying figure. Many feared the country would drift without his presence, but it didn't. That was his final triumph, that the system held when he was gone. Public memorials rose almost immediately. Cities named counties and streets after him. Painters and sculptors began their tributes. The new federal city on the Potomac, already bearing his name, became the permanent seat of government. Monuments could honor him, but the real monument was the government itself, still functioning, still free. What struck me most in those weeks was how people from every background claimed him as their own. Veterans remembered the general who shared their hardships. Merchants spoke of the president who stabilized their currency. Farmers recalled the man who returned to his plow when he could have remained in power. Even foreign nations paid respect. Napoleon ordered a week of mourning in France. The British Navy lowered its flags. That tells you something about the reach of his example. History has produced many conquerors, but few founders. Washington's greatness was not in expanding territory or winning glory. It was in restraint, knowing when to act, when to stop, and when to step aside. His restraint made Republican government credible at a time when most of the world believed it impossible. He wasn't a man of many words or grand theories. He wasn't a philosopher like Jefferson or a financier like Hamilton. He was a man of judgment. He decided carefully, listened more than he spoke, and held his temper when others lost theirs. That may not sound extraordinary, but in politics it's rare enough to be revolutionary. In the years that followed, his example became the standard for the presidency. 2 terms and no more. Civilian authority over the military. Neutrality in foreign conflicts. Moderation in domestic affairs. Every president who came after him had to measure himself against that record, whether he admitted it or not. But his legacy wasn't limited to government. It reached into the character of the nation itself, the idea that leadership is service, not privilege. He showed that authority could exist without corruption, that a republic could be both strong and free. Those lessons became part of the national habit, at least in the best of times. When I look back on the years we shared, the war, the convention, the long labor of nation building, What stands out is not his victories, but his patience. Washington never mistook popularity for success. He was often criticized, often misunderstood, but he never answered with bitterness. That steadiness built more faith in the government than any speech or law could have done. "I had rather be on my farm than emperor of the world," he once told me. And he meant it. The man who could have been king chose to be a citizen. That choice, more than any battle or proclamation, secured our liberty. Even in death, his presence lingered. People continued to write about him, to argue over his decisions, to praise or critique his judgment. That's inevitable. But no honest historian can deny what he accomplished. He led a revolution without becoming a tyrant. He built a government without destroying its spirit. And when he could have ruled for life, he went home. Generations from now, I expect his name will still carry weight, not because it's carved on buildings, but because his conduct remains the model of what leadership in a republic should be: calm, limited, and accountable. It's fitting, I think, that he rests on the banks of the Potomac, looking out over the river that bears his name. He once said that the work of independence would never truly end, that each generation would have to defend it in its own way. He was right. The Republic was never meant to rest. It was meant to endure through vigilance and virtue. If Washington's life teaches anything, it's that freedom depends not on perfection, but on consistency, on men and women doing their duty without needing applause. That was his secret. No miracles, no eloquence, just steadiness. And sometimes that's enough to change the world. So ends the life of George Washington, soldier, statesman, and citizen. His story is inseparable from the story of the country itself. The flag still flies, the Constitution still stands, and the example remains. That is legacy enough for any man.